For those of you who missed the opening, we dedicated the show tonight to Angela Lloyd, who passed away last weekend. If you would like to stay, I'm going to show a video in a moment, one of Angela's stories that she told for us about a year ago. We all, everyone who knew Angela loved her. It was impossible not to. She was a friend instantly. I got to know her about a year ago. No, I got to know her in 2020. Back then, right as the pandemic started, we started doing story swaps, and Angela came to one of our first story swaps. And I thought, oh, this kid's got potential. She might make a storyteller one of these days. Um, she was a fabulous storyteller. And so I invited her to come and start telling stories with us, which she did. And she told stories with so many of you, and she was always a delight. At the end of each year, we have a show about food, a show about love, because love is food and food is love. And we ask our storytellers for recipes. And our very first one in December of 2020, Angela was in that show. And I asked her for a recipe. And this is just, if you don't know Angela, I want to just read a little bit of the recipe she provided. This is for a recipe collection. She gave us the recipe for lemon chicken. And just like Angela, it starts off very straightforward. She says, "This is my favorite whole baked chicken recipe. I learned it from an Italian cookbook. I cook it for guests and make it for Larry, and we enjoy the leftovers." And then she starts with the ingredients. You wash a whole chicken. You set it on a plate on an angle and let the water drain off. You shake salt and pepper on the inside, and then it progressively gets more and more interesting. Put the whole chicken in a baking dish. Bake it for 30 minutes at 350 degrees. There's time in this half hour to write a postcard to a friend or read a fairy tale laying down on the couch. Turn the chicken over in the baking dish and bake it for another 30 minutes. If it is summer and still light out, take your laundry off the line. Then turn the oven up to 400 degrees and continue baking. Stay in the house because the baking has fragrance. Read a poem or two. Ask someone to read them to you. Always read poems out loud with an easy walking pace. Take the chicken out and let it stand a few minutes before serving. It will be juicy, moist, savory, and yummy. Enjoy. Remember this, kissing don't last, cook and do. With love, Angela Lloyd.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Mama thinks I'm living in a convent. "1980, summer. I traveled to Mallorca, Palma de Mallorca. My mother was there. She'd gone for 4 months. I was traveling with my sweetheart, David, and we'd gone to spend 3 weeks with her. I just finished 18 months on a government-funded equity union contract with a children's theater company. It was time to play. Summer. I'm wondering if it's happened to you where you participated in something in your life and then later you look back and it seemed to you perhaps someone had written a script cast the roles and you had played out your part, and it had been a grand design. My mother was in Mallorca for 4 months. My parents had decided to sell the house they owned there. My mother had a secret. She wanted to spend a month there before my father came over to visit. She would tidy up the house. She would put it all back in order. She would dust off the paintings I grew up with in our home in Caracas, Venezuela. She would reset the table her father hired a Navajo carpenter to make, the table that lived in our dining room in Caracas, Venezuela, where I sat at the stereo console listening to Mitch Miller singing along, reading the lyrics once I could read. That table was in Mallorca, the artwork we grew up with, other furniture, beautiful, precious objects. Everything had been moved to Mallorca in 1973, and my parents were going to retire there. But change, nothing is constant but change. And my father had changed his mind, and he wanted to sell the home. And my mama said, may I go and spend the summer there? And then you sell it. He said, go ahead. So she was there, and she did tidy up. She completely made it spotless with help. And then my father came over. They spent 2 glorious weeks together. And he flew home on the day I flew over with David. We would be there for 3 weeks. David was a gardener. So one of the things we did was plant the deep red roses in the garden. The garden was downstairs from the house. There was a small pool and then more stairs down into a beautiful garden that looked out over other homes and olive trees. Every day we walked the trash up to this road because that's when they would come every night to pick up trash in Palma de Mallorca, 1980. So it was always a small bag. It was always an evening walk after dinner. On one of the days, I found my mother's copy of The Prophet, and I'd never read it. It was her copy from college, and she drove us to the beach later that day. David and I spent the whole day there, and she picked us up in the afternoon, and I read The Prophet on the beach. I was used to reading on the beach, and often David would go for a run down the water's edge. He had a red bathing suit, just like my Ken doll. I didn't have my Ken doll in graduate school when I met David, but he had a red bathing suit, and he participated in runs and races, and I always had the t-shirts. He didn't. He had a lot of t-shirts. So those t-shirts I wore in grad school for dance class, cut them off at the mid so that I could see my body in the mirrors. David went for a long run, and I read The Prophet. And that evening, we did some more planting, mulching. We actually gathered pine needles on the way home, laid them down in the rose bed, and then we had a lovely evening at home. The next day, we went to gather with some friends in right walking distance, drinks with friends that live nearby. They were new to me, new to David. And then we walked further into town and had supper in a small little restaurant and then walked home. We sat on the terrace that night, that beautiful evening breeze. I know you know it, sitting outside, the wind on your skin. I'm going away to leave you, love. I'm going away for a while. But I'll return to you someday if I go 10,000 miles. The storms are on the ocean. The heavens will cease to be. This world will lose its motion, love, if I prove false to thee. Well, who will shoe your pretty little foot? And who will glove your hand? And who will be your own true love while I'm in a foreign land? When you go visit your mama in Palma de Mallorca with your sweetheart, you don't sleep with your sweetheart. He sleeps downstairs in the guest bedroom, and I was sleeping in the large king-size bed my parents shared. My father now back in Fort Lauderdale, and I was sleeping on his side of the bed. When we tucked in that night, I brought the copy of The Prophet with me, and I was telling my mom that I was thinking about the next time we would do a concert together. We'd done our first in the fall of '79. She'd been invited to Key Biscayne concert series to play a piano concert. Did I tell you she was a composer? Did I tell you she was a pianist? She invited me to do the concert with her. She said, maybe we could choose some poems. I would write a suite. And that's what we did. E. E. Cummings, Emily Dickinson, Edna St. Vincent Millay. We were very tired, one of hers. We were very merry. We'd gone back and forth all night on the ferry, and you ate an apple, and I ate a pear. My mother wrote a suite for piano, and she tucked them in 6 pieces of music, a minute and a half long, solo piano in between these groups of 4 poems, 3 poems, 4 poems by Garcia Lorca, Pedro Salinas, Pablo Neruda, in Spanish. Did I tell you I grew up speaking Spanish? When my mother wrote the program, she described herself as a composer pianist. And when she wrote the descriptor for me, she wrote Angela Lloyd disuse, Disuse, disuse. Mama, I said, what is that? She said, it's a French word. I said, Mama, no one's going to know what that means. She said, let him look it up. And she made that gesture with her hand. Let him look it up. What does it mean? Someone who does solo monologue work, disuse. We loved doing that work together. I loved preparing those poems. Trained as an actor, I knew how to work with text, how to plant my feet, tell the truth. In bed that night, I said, Mama, I think I'd like to include some of these from The Prophet. I never read it before, Mama. I mean, listen to this. It says, work is love made visible. That's a good one, she said. I said, in this one, it says the children that are born to you, they're not yours. It is as though there is a ceiling and a porch and columns that hold it. The children come from you. They are of you. They are not you. You must let them go. I said, that's a really good one. I said, and look at this. The Pedro Salinas poem I said in Spanish, and she always did free translations for the program. It opens with, are you love, a long goodbye that never ends? To live from the beginning is to be severed. Mama, listen to this in The Prophet. And ever has it been that love knows not its own depth until the hour of separation. It's the same thought as at the end of the poem. Then there was one, well, my mom was getting tired. She was cozy in her nightgown, and she said, I'm going to go to sleep now. You can share more tomorrow. And she rolled over to sleep, to roll on her side. And then suddenly she rolled back and she gave me a kiss. Good night. And I remember that kiss. It had a lot of energy. I remember just in the moment thinking, whoa, that was a really nice kiss. It was a big kiss from my mother. And then I continued reading from the prophet. And there was a chapter that said, when joy is sitting at your table, sorrow may be asleep in your bed. That reminded me of a chant from Wind in the Willows. Mind you, my mother's going to sleep. I'm in bed. It's late. David's downstairs. And here comes this chant. Maybe it's happened to you, something you've known all your life. Wind in the Willows, the chant, the call outside a door. Villagers all this frosty tide, let your door swing open wide, though the wind be cold and the snow beside, yet draw us in by your fire to bide. Joy shall be yours in the morning. I read that rest of some of the passages, and then I went to sleep. And the next morning when I woke up, I got up early, scooted out of bed and went downstairs and told David not to go for his early run because we were going to go to the early church service at the Episcopal Church. And I came back upstairs to wake up my mother. And I couldn't wake my mother. I couldn't wake my mother. Would she sleep 100 years? I went down and got David. And David tried to wake my mother. My mother was asleep. We called the Episcopal priest. He told us, gave us the phone number. Well, he said he'd come over, 1. 2, he said, here's the phone number for the mortuary. You should call them so they could come. And so we made those calls, talked in Spanish, home sweet home. And then I went next door and told the women who lived next door to my mother that summer, who had lived there many years. You know, they washed their hair standing outside on the cobblestones and washed their hair upside down in a bowl, the dog sitting close by. In Palma de Mallorca, the roads are really slender. They're tiny, and the cars are tiny. And when the 2 men arrived from the mortuary, my first thought when I saw them was they look like Columbo's brothers, flapping black coats. And they got out of this tiny car and then opened the hatchback, and it almost was like a clown car at a circus. Like what else would come out of it? And they pulled out a long pine box and brought it in and laid it down next to my mother. And then they were like, ay, 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 este tamaño no se queda para ella. Ella es muy alta. She's tall, they said. This box isn't long enough. And they said, vamos a regresar con otro. I said, gracias. We'll be here. I remember thinking when they went left and came back, I remember standing in the living room, the grand piano in the living room, and thinking, I'll never hear my mother tell her point of view, the story from her voice. I'll never hear that again. That's actually not true. But I do know this, that as years passed, I realized that I would always miss my mother seeing me. Did I tell you I was 26 when I was there? They came, and I realized before they came back that my mother was wearing her rings, and I took them off her hand. And I remember it was hard. It was difficult. I came back to Sarasota after my father came over. We were there 2 more weeks. We buried my mother in Mallorca. But I want you to know that I came back to Sarasota, Florida, And all I could think was, my mother initiated so much, so many opportunities of the concerts she played in her life, the recitals. She chose work, poetry she wanted to set. And I thought, if she could do that, perhaps I could do that, that I could make my way in the world by my making the first phone call, not waiting for someone to call me. And that's what I carried home. And that's how I've made my way in the world. And just a little side note, a story for another time. How do you get to Carnegie Recital Hall? You rent the hall. I just want to say that the thing about Cinderella going to the ball, and I know I'm jumping here, is that all Cinderella needed to go to the ball was to say she would like to go. And anytime I tell stories, my mother is with me. And I don't need to go to Carnegie Hall to do a concert on the anniversary of her concert, which I did apply to do, and they gave me the date. But my brother said, Angela, every time you tell, our mother is there. Blackbird singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise.